Welcome back, I'm Steve and thank you for joining me on my photography journey. Now it's time to start looking at some of this in a bit more detail, looking at some of the photography terms that you may have heard of, but you may not have understood, until now that is. So in the coming weeks we'll talk about exposure, ISO, aperture, priority mode, white balance, depth of field, bokeh, bracketing, stacking, to name some of the terms that we'll use. So grab a coffee and let's get started. ISO rather than ISO, but to be honest it doesn't really matter what you say as long as you know what it does. The name comes from the International Organization for Standardization. These are people that create standards across different industries all around the world, different languages, different countries. They even did it with their own names. So obviously ISO doesn't stand for International Organization for Standardization, but because that translates differently in different languages, they wanted something that was universal. So ISO was what they decided on. One of the standards that they created was how sensitive camera film is to light. So different numbers represent different sensitivities. The higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light. So now that we don't have film in cameras, things are slightly different, but the same logic still applies. Rather than the sensor that changes, it's more of an amplification of the light that comes into it. So think of it more like turning the volume up on the light that comes into the camera. Sounds great, doesn't it? So if you've got a dark image, just twist the dial, up the ISO, and good picture. But of course there are some downsides to this as well. So increasing the ISO, because it's artificially increasing the light that's coming in, you can end up with some noise coming into your picture. So let's have a look at some examples just to demonstrate that. So we've got a picture here of a low ISO, and we've got a picture here with a high ISO, and if we zoom in on these we can see the difference in that noise, in that kind of discoloration and effect that you get from increasing the ISO. And something that I found out recently as well, the higher the ISO, the bigger the file size for some reason. I need to look into that one. So as you can see, there is a bit of a delicate balance between setting your ISO too low, so you end up with a dark image, or too high and get lots of noise. So over the next few weeks we're going to be talking about two other factors that make up what's called the exposure triangle. So that's the aperture and the shutter speed. But for today let's look into ISO in a bit more detail. Most cameras have a minimum ISO of about 100 and a maximum of 51,200, or some go even higher than that. This scale means that when you double the number, you're doubling the amount of light that comes into the camera, or in this case the amplification of that number. That's something that we call a stop. A stop. What is a stop? So a lot of photography is subjective. You look at a picture, it's light, it's dark, there's something nice, there's something that you don't like so much, and what we want is a kind of way to quantify it and say this is over or underexposed by this much. So when we talk about a stop, we're talking about a doubling or halving of the light that's coming in. So a simple example is shutter speed. A shutter speed of 1 second lets in twice the amount of light as a shutter speed of half a second. That makes sense, nice and straightforward. And we call that one stop. But that's quite a big difference. So rather than just having everything in stops, you'll see that on your camera there are lots of smaller increments, usually a third of a stop. For example, the Nikon Z5 that I has this range of values for the ISO, and you can pick and choose which one you want. You don't have to have a full stop, you can have a half or a third. So when would you want to increase this? If it's going to cause noise, to get this kind of grainy effect in your pictures, when would you actually want to increase your ISO? So this comes back to talk about that exposure triangle. So having those three different factors that make up your exposure, how bright or how dark your image is. If you want to keep one of those at a specific value, so for example, if you've got a moving subject, you want to be able to take a very quick picture so that the image freezes them in time. You don't want them to look blurry, unless that's the effect that you're going for. So you need a fast shutter speed. Faster shutter speeds let less light into the camera. You need to compensate for this somehow, either by making the area brighter, which if you're in a studio you can do with lights. If you're outside, you can't really control that quite so well, so you need to find a different way of increasing the amount of light in that picture. So one of the ways that you can do that is by changing your ISO. If you've got a nicely exposed picture but your subject is blurry like this, then something that you could do is change your ISO to make it a bit brighter, like this. For something like landscape photography, you're not that interested in capturing something like fast moving mountains or a sudden moving tree. You more want to gather as much light as you can. It doesn't matter if your exposure is 30 seconds, a minute. What you want to do is capture what's in front of you. So the way that we kind of look at it then is that you have a lower ISO, so say 100, but then you increase your shutter speed in order to get all that light in that you want, so that you can capture the image. There are exceptions, so if you wanted to take a picture of a waterfall and get that lovely smooth flowing water look, that needs a longer shutter speed. You need to play around with your ISO in order to be able to do that. So the real test is balancing your ISO, your shutter speed and your aperture. So as I said before, that's known as your exposure triangle. These are the three basic settings that will affect the image, what will come out of your camera and how things will look at the end of it. So this is what you should know. You should understand how changing one of them affects another one, and how you get the best combination of them for what you're going to take. So let's have a look at a quick example. So this is a beautiful landscape picture. You can see that the foliage is looking nice in front of the background. This was taken at 1/80th of a second. It's f1.8 and has an ISO of 100. So let's just zoom into it a bit, and you can see the detail of the leaves, and looking at the white, it just looks like a white bookcase, which strangely enough it is. But if we change some of our settings a bit and increase the ISO, so this one is 1/320th of a second, it's at f16, so both of those two combined make your image darker. So to compensate and get it looking kind of the same brightness, we've gone for a ISO of 102,400, so a huge increase. So this is an extreme example, but it kind of illustrates the point. So if we zoom in on here, you can see the huge amount of noise that we've got in this picture. It looks grainy, doesn't look very nice really, does it? It doesn't look as smooth as it should do. And that's what happens when you increase your ISO. So what else can we do with this? We have got various situations where, for example, I've got two different lenses. One of them is an f4, one of them is an f1.8. So that is the aperture size, how much light actually comes through the front of the lens into the camera. Which aperture you use will influence what the picture looks like. So as you can see here, this is at f4 and all of the picture is nicely in focus. You've got all the leaves, you can see the background and things, all looks good. And the next picture is at f1.8. So here you can see that there's less in focus. It looks like there's more of a separation between the picture between the plant in the picture and the background, and that's something that the Aperture controls. So f1.8 is a bigger hole for the light to come through, so more light gets in. So to keep these two pictures exposed by the same amount, we need to change something else. So as you can see in the settings here, they're both at the same shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. The apertures are different because they're different lenses. So to compensate for that, we've had to change the ISO. So with the f4 lens, we've got an ISO of 2500, and for the f1.8 lens, we've got an ISO of 500. So quite a big difference. Now, I don't know whether you can actually see any difference in any grain or noise between these two. There we go. So there is definitely a bit more noise in the f4 picture because, again, the ISO has had to be increased, but it's not that noticeable. It depends what you're going to do with the picture. So it just gives you that little bit of control over something to kind of keep the same amount of light in your picture. So again, we'll come back to when would you want to change your ISO, and that very much depends on what you're taking a picture of. So when do you want to change the ISO? As with everything in photography, it entirely depends on what you see through the viewfinder, what's in front of you, and how you want your picture to look at the end of it. So changing one element of the exposure triangle will impact the others. So that's the thing that you need to keep in mind, that all of these little changes will impact the others and change that overall look and feel of your image. So it's choosing what you want to do with it, which is why we're in manual mode, so that you've got the most control over your settings and the most you have the most control over what comes out at the end. Automatic mode does a great job. The camera makes these decisions for you and tries to give you a good picture. It tries to make sure that it's balanced, it's not too light, not too dark, so it changes these settings for you in order to do it. But that's what I kind of think is the difference between a photographer who wants to be more in control and create a particular look, whether it's as realistic as possible or to be more of a style and have their own stamp on something. No right, no wrong. It's an art form. It's very subjective. So what I like won't be liked by everybody. And it's learning these skills which makes you more of a photographer and less of just taking a snapshot. Got your camera on auto mode, take a snapshot, let the camera do the work. Whereas what I'm trying to achieve is I want to have the control over these settings in order to get the picture to look how I want it to look. And that's what we're going to look at as the weeks go by, to make sure that we know what these settings are, how we can change them, and how they can impact other things. And I hope you join me for more of that. So I just want to say thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe so that you automatically join me again next week, and leave a comment. Talk to me about what we've covered today, ask any questions that you might have, and then next week we'll go into a bit more detail on something else. So we'll keep going around the exposure triangle, so we'll look at shutter speed next week and how that works with ISO to help in getting your shot how you want. So have a great week, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.